Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 22, The Long 7th Century, Part 3, Moloch. Well, gang, I made it to America. I'm as settled in as I'll be, so let's get right back into it. In our last narrative episode, I talked a bit about child sacrifice, such a fun subject, mostly focusing on some of the more positive mentions of the practice in the Bible and how folktales like the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac, are built on the foundation of sacrificial mythology and real cultic practice, a motif that hangs heavily over many texts composed during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE and their fallout afterward. We're speeding headlong into the end of several of our ancient Middle Eastern kingdoms. Many of the authors and editors of the Hebrew Bible lived in the wake of the traumatic destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the glorious Judahite monarchy, and they reckoned with these practices and decided that killing kids to feed your god was a bad idea. Whether they were horrified by the practice because of the idea of slaughtering babies or because they considered it foreign is difficult to know. But despite the constant polemicizing against child sacrifice, vestiges of the practice slipped through the cracks, as we saw last time. Ezekiel, the prophet who didn't approve of child sacrifice, but believed Yahweh had commanded it. The Exodus 22 law from the Covenant Code, the oldest law collection in the Bible, which demanded the handing over of the firstborn son for sacrifice. The odd circumcision laws, which seem to insist that the practice of child genital modification is a worthy substitute for child sacrifice, most notably Zipporah circumcising her son before Moses or Yahweh could kill him. But that's about where I left it, and today I'll pick up on this thread. So some people believed Yahweh commanded child sacrifice, and even those that didn't, like Jeremiah, were scandalized by its existence. But what did it actually look like? Where did child sacrifice come from? And who the hell is Moloch anyway? Needless to say, this is going to be a bit of a heavy episode, and so if you're someone who is sensitive to some fairly explicit descriptions of infant slaughter, this is your warning. Like last episode, the two main sources for today are Francesca Stavrakopoulou's King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, and Heath Dewrell's Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel. As always, these and all other sources will be listed in the bibliography portion of the episode description. And of course, you can help this show continue to exist by becoming a supporter at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. Now, this episode's format is a little bit different. I've done a few heavily lore-focused episodes. Episode 5 covered Gilgamesh. Episode 11 discussed the two father gods of Israel, Yahweh and El Elyon. But mostly I've structured this show around chronological political history, taking us through the twists and turns of the history of ancient West Asia and centering on Palestine and the empires that ruled over the land. Today I'm doing a bit of both, lore and history. Primarily, I'll be telling a broader history of the practice of child sacrifice, its various forms and practitioners, and how it changed over time and faded away. This means I'll be backtracking a bit before our 7th century present moment, and also going past the 7th century and into the future. Part of the reason is that, well, this is the Manasseh episode, and there's not a lot to say about the guy in history. No joke, not even the author of Kings is really interested in him. Like I said last time, he's primarily just said to be the worst guy ever, the cause of Jerusalem's downfall, and that's about it. And the Manasseh of history doesn't fare much better. He seems to have mostly just kept his head down and been a good vassal, while Ashurbanipal struggled to hold on to Egypt. Ashurbanipal gets the bigger story here, and he's history's more famous guy. That said, I'll talk about how Manasseh dealt with being Ashurbanipal's vassal, but there really ain't much to tell. It was a period of relatively boring peace and prosperity and rebuilding in the Levant. And that's one of the most interesting parts of the history of Palestine. It functions as a sort of Forrest Gump of history, blundering into the background of more famous characters. So much of it is on the outskirts of what we consider more important figures and events and empires. As we've seen in recent episodes, the Israelites and Judahites have been subjects of the world's first large empire, albeit on the outskirts of Assyria. And that will continue to be the case for Palestine throughout its history. Alexander the Great will do a drive-by conquest and one of his successors will take over. And after a time, the Romans will move in during the age of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great and all of these famous figures. The Romans accuse their greatest nemesis, Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, of practicing child sacrifice. Carthage was, if you'll remember, the city built by Phoenician traders from Lebanon and allegedly their legendary founding queen, Dido. There are several famous tales of Carthaginian elites sacrificing children and babies, including in one case to forestall their coming destruction after the great city had been besieged in the late 4th century BCE by a Sicilian military commander from Syracuse. Dewrell notes that the Sicilian historian Diodorus, writing in the 1st century BCE, a few hundred years after the events themselves, recounts the siege of Carthage, how after being surrounded and panicking, the rulers and elders of the city became convinced that they had upset one of their chief gods, Kronos, in some way, and so, quote, they were superstitiously afraid, and as they had neglected the ancestral honor of the gods. Eager to correct their mistakes, selecting 200 of the most distinguished children, they sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under accusation willingly gave themselves, no fewer than 300. There was among them a bronze statue of Kronos, having outstretched hands, palms up, and sloping toward the ground, so that one of the children placed there would roll down and fall into a pit full of fire. End quote. Yes, it's not lost to me that Kronos is the god receiving the sacrifices here, and he's infamously also the god who eats his own children in Greek and Roman mythology. Maybe there's some kind of connection there, but I haven't seen it posited before. So if you're aware of scholarship that proposes a connection between real human sacrifice and the Kronos eating his kids mythology, send an email to BibleLorePodcast@gmail.com. But anyway, the function of this alleged Punic ritual is not to keep your kids from power like Kronos eating his kiddos. It's instead an emergency sacrifice. Longtime listeners will remember that we have a similar story in the Bible, the infamous tale of King Mesha in 2 Kings 3, where the Moabite ruler similarly sacrifices his own firstborn son during a siege, resulting in the god Chemosh chasing the Israelite coalition out of his lands and back into Israel and Judah. As far as whether this happened in either case, it's hard to say. Certainly several Greek and Roman accounts accuse the Carthaginians of sacrificing their children, and in this case, Diodorus' account is interesting because he specifically claims that the people of Carthage thought their god had rejected them because they failed to honor the older rites of child sacrifice. And this, at least, has some basis in history, as the practice did disappear a bit before Diodorus' time, and possibly through waves it sort of faded out of existence. Later biblical authors will do what Diodorus probably did and work some of these real practices into their fictional stories, and it approaches likely slander in the severity of the accusations against Carthage. 200 children at once, that's not something we have evidence for, and it has all the makings of a libelous attack against one's enemies. And there were scholars in the 19th century who, because of this, considered it likely that the entire idea of child sacrifice had been Roman propaganda invented by opponents of Carthage, even if some accusations were not quite as salacious as our Sicilian historians. But Diodorus, as tall of a tale as he might have told, wasn't inventing things out of thin air. To sort all this out, to tell the real history of Moloch and child sacrifice, we need to go back in time and reverse Dido's trip, heading from Carthage back to Phoenicia, which has been proposed as a likely candidate for the origins of child sacrifice rites. This was the center of a big trade network, so their culture went with them throughout the Mediterranean. And because of this, Phoenicia has been the source of a lot of what we know about the Bible's place in the larger scheme of Iron Age mythology. They're neighbors. The coastal trading cities of Tyre and Sidon had never suffered as much as Ugarit during the Bronze Age collapse, and both cities have remained populated more or less continuously since then. Yahweh shares a holy mountain, Saphon, with Phoenician Baal, and has significant roots in Baal's storm god lore. But oddly enough, while Baal does get occasionally accused of being a child sacrifice recipient by the biblical authors, and this would help paint the practice as a foreign one, he's not the most well-known god associated with ritual child killing in the good book. That would be Molech, or Moloch. He's a shadowy figure, never actually described but only mentioned in passing. Unlike Baal, who gets consistently polemicized against as Yahweh's primary nemesis throughout much of the Hebrew Bible. Molech, on the other hand, is scarcely seen like horror villains from the best 70s horror movies. Michael Myers or Alien Xenomorph or the shark from Jaws. He receives a mere handful of mentions. There's one oracle in Jeremiah 32, which the author sets in the year of the final siege of Jerusalem. Yahweh commands the prophet to buy a field and bury a jar with the deed to the land in it, because Yahweh's about to send everyone into exile. But the prophet believes his God will restore them to Judah and follows his command. He buries the sealed title to the land, a symbol of a hoped-for return, like modern Palestinians still hanging on to the keys to their houses. Yahweh proceeds to explain why he's exiling the Judahites. They worshipped Baal, and frankly, they were annoying Yahweh by disobeying him from day one. And then we get the kicker, quote, "They have turned their backs to me, not their faces. Though I have taught them persistently, they would not listen and accept correction. They set up their abominations in the house that bears my name and defiled it. They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to offer up their sons and daughters to Molech, though I did not command them, nor did it enter my mind, that they should do this abomination, causing Judah to sin." There's something curious in this passage, which probably reached its final form a couple hundred years after Jeremiah lived. It says they built up the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom, a real location a bit outside of Jerusalem. This valley is associated in a couple places with child sacrifice, but here it's specifically referred to as a site for Baal. And then on top of that, it's saying that the child sacrifices were offered to Molech, not even to Baal. If they were for Baal, it seems likely the author would have mentioned it, as he does in chapter 19 when Yahweh is providing a similar oracle about why Jerusalem is being destroyed. Quote, "Because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent and gone on building the high places of Baal to burn their children in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or decree, nor did it enter my mind." So what the hell is that other mention of a high place for Baal, but also for Molech, all about? The fact that Molech is usually associated with the valley of Ben Hinnom makes it seem much more likely that it's Baal who's inserted here. But why would they stick Baal into this passage? Wasn't Moloch a good enough villain? Part of the problem, and a main theme of this episode, is that Moloch may have, never been a god at all. Let me explain a bit, starting with some tedious linguistic stuff. Bear with me. Before the medieval period, Hebrew was typically written without the vowels included, and the vowels were implied from the context. This is imported from the Phoenician alphabet, from which Hebrew emerged. This is why Yahweh's name is typically spelled out as YHWH in the Hebrew alphabet. That's Yod He Vav He. The Vav is kind of like the German W. It can be pronounced somewhere between the English W and V. So Yahweh, Yahweh, something like that. That's also why Yahweh is just the best guess at what the divine name originally sounded like, considering the fact that Jews stopped pronouncing it in the centuries after the exile and then stopped writing it out entirely, replacing it with Adonai, or in English translations, the Lord, and leaving us to try and figure out the vowels for ourselves. In fact, a fair bit of the editing and redaction and subtle changes in the Hebrew Bible relied on the similarity between different consonant-only words. If you thought having 3 theirs and a million other homophones like in English was tough, imagine your entire script lacked vowels. This lack of vowels wasn't uncommon for many written languages before the Common Era, though. In fact, many Semitic scripts use this same system, relying on familiarity with the spoken language for the reader to infer the vowels. Again, this was inherited from the Phoenician alphabet, the script that served as the basis for Hebrew and, indeed, the overwhelming majority of alphabetic scripts today. There will be a lot more Phoenicia in this episode. Keep an ear out for those folks. So this lack of vowels means that what we're dealing with when we talk about Molech is a word which is spelled Mem Lamed Kaf, or MLK, in its English equivalents, hence Molech or Moloch. And this takes us to the idea of Molech as a god. The biggest issue is that no record of such a god has ever been found that seems to correspond to the specifics of child sacrifice in ancient West Asia. There have been several wide-ranging proposals for Moloch as a god, such as Milku or Melkart, again inferring the vowels and aligning them with cuneiform gods' names, but nothing quite fits right considering where and when the accusations about Moloch come from. A handful of mentions in the Hebrew Bible from people living in Palestine at earliest in the Late Iron Age. The gods that folks stretch to claim as Moloch are primarily from the Bronze Age or otherwise centuries earlier than our first mentions of Moloch in the Bible. As I mentioned, the composition of some of these texts started somewhere in the Late Iron Age around the Levant, around our present moment in the 600s BCE. Adding to the problem is the fact that the prophetic texts in the Torah, where these mentions of Moloch are found, underwent a centuries-long editing and redaction process. So we've got a serious puzzle on our hand, and this gives us just a handful of passages throughout all of ancient history which attest to a god of child sacrifice named Moloch or Molech, all of which are found in the Hebrew Bible. The most detailed screed against the child-eating god comes in Leviticus 20, quote, "And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, And to the Israelites you shall say, Every man of the Israelites, and of the sojourners who sojourn in Israel, who gives of his seed to Molech, is doomed to die. The people of the land shall stone him. And as for me, I shall set my face against the man, and cut him off from the midst of his people. For he has given of his seed to Molech, so as to defile my sanctuary, and to profane my sacred name. And if the people of the land actually avert their eyes from that man, when he gives of his seed to Molech, not putting him to death, I myself shall turn my face against the man and his clan, and I shall cut him off and all who go whoring after him to whore after Molech from the midst of their people." That passage constitutes more than half of all mentions of Molech in the Hebrew Bible. Hell, one of the other mentions in 1 Kings 11 is almost certainly just a scribal fuck-up, where they accidentally said Molech was the god of the Ammonites when they meant Milcom, the patron deity of the Ammonites. So that leaves us with even fewer mentions. And the question is this: could those passages have been misunderstood or intentionally reinterpreted to talk about a god, either due to later scribes making a mistake or occasionally through intentional obfuscation? What if Moloch wasn't a god at all, but instead a specific ritual related to child sacrifice? Nearly 100 years ago, a scholar named Otto Eisfeld first argued exactly that in print. Eisfeld's argument came in the shadow of a monumental discovery. For the first time, archaeologists and academics discovered a word spelled MLK associated with child sacrifice in contemporary writing from the 7th century and beyond. Molech, at least as a word, had been found, and in the archaeological discoveries, it didn't refer to a god at all. Let me explain. Throughout the Mediterranean, at around a dozen sites from Tunisia, site of ancient Carthage, to Sicily and Sardinia, to Spain, archaeological digs over the last centuries have uncovered small, typically walled-in sites where standing stones mark the locations of buried jars, sometimes several jars in close proximity. Stamped on the stele is often a formulaic inscription. Here's an example, quote, "Presented to the Lord Baal-Hamon and the lady Tinnet Fanabel is the vow that Himilco, son of Bostar, son of Nabal, vowed, being the mulk sacrifice of a person of his own flesh, because they heard his voice and blessed him." So let's break this down. The word transliterated as mulk here is the Phoenician equivalent of mem lamed kaf in Hebrew, MLK, the same word that is often interpreted as referring to the deity Moloch in the Hebrew Bible. But in these formulaic inscriptions, mulk is clearly not referring to a god. It is a mulk sacrifice for Baal-Hamon in fulfillment of a vow. And what's translated as mulk sacrifice of a person is mulk Adam in the original text. Adam here being the reference to a human. The cognate word in Hebrew is where we get the name Adam, based on the Hebrew word for human, Adam. At least I assume so. I didn't double check on this one, so if a linguist wants to yell at me, please send all emails to danmcclellan@gmail.com. In addition to these inscriptions, the stelae also contain iconography. While much of the iconography is relatively abstract, some seem to contain depictions of the ritual that resulted in the jar's burial. One features a man holding a blade, another holding an infant, and what seems to be an altar. So these are the stelae. Let's work our way into the dirt. Inside the buried jars, excavators have time and time again found the same uncomfortable contents, exactly what one would expect considering the inscriptions. The texts and iconography are accurate depictions of what's in the box.
Well, I don't know what I expected.
Charred remains, sometimes human infants, sometimes small children, sometimes animals, sometimes a mix of human and animal bones. At one site in Algeria, we get an example of a replacement practice where animals were subbed in for humans, with a sacrifice coming from a couple named Felix and Diodora. The inscription taken from a stele in the burial site is in Latin, quote, "Prosperity and salvation to the holy Lord Saturn, a great nocturnal sacrifice, breath for breath, blood for blood, life for the salvation of Francesca." On account of a vision and a vow, Felix and Diodora have offered a sacrifice, namely a molcamor, with joyful hearts, a lamb as a vicarious substitute. Molcamor in the Latin there is the key differentiator in Felix and Diodora's sacrifice compared to Himilco's similar vow. His was a molc Adam, theirs was a molcamor, substituting a lamb, as in the later biblical redemption offers, where a lamb could be sacrificed in place of offering the firstborn, found in, for example, Exodus 13, quote, "You shall set apart to Yahweh all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn offspring of your livestock that are males shall be Yahweh's. But every firstborn donkey you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. Every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem." To be clear, this is not the same ritual as the molc sacrifices, as there is no vow and every firstborn is to be redeemed, and the term molc is not associated with firstborn killings for Yahweh. But the practice of swapping in an animal has a lot of salience between the realities of the Punic practices and the literary rhetoric found in later biblical texts that distance themselves from all forms of child sacrifice. This became the replacement for child sacrifice. In earlier times, however, it seems that child sacrifice, and especially the molc ritual, had become a popular practice, maybe one of the darkest cultural fads of all time. There have been thousands and thousands of molc jars with burned remains found at these sites throughout the Mediterranean. This was not a rare or uncommon practice at all, particularly throughout the period we're discussing now, the 8th and 7th and 6th centuries, though it likely stretches back further. So based on these inscriptions, here's how the molc sacrifice would work. A presumably young husband and wife would make a vow to their god that whenever the woman had a baby, for a variety of reasons, they would give it to the god as a burnt offering. Sometimes it seems to be a request for a large family, the idea that giving up a child now would satisfy the deity to bless them with more successful pregnancies. Last time we covered Jephthah's promise to sacrifice his daughter in return for victory in battle, and while that does seem to be vaguely associated with how our molc sacrifices work, the reality is that that story is actually an extremely common folk tale found in a variety of old texts throughout the region, even in societies with no connection to child sacrifice. The names and circumstances are changed, but unfortunately, it seems unlikely that Jephthah's sacrifice is an attestation of a real molc practice or someone with familiarity with it. It was a folk tale. Maybe it had a lot of purchase as a story because the biblical authors were aware of molc, but it's hard to draw any kind of straight line besides the vow to the god. People just like stories with a fucked up twist ending. It's a good kind of story. So anyway, to get the ritual going, the couple would, well, engage in sexual congress.
You mean coitus?
And if everything went well, after about 9 months, the baby would be born. At some point, probably only a short time in most cases, and at the latest when the child was a few years old, the couple would bring the baby to a priest or other cultic official at the god's local temple or shrine, and then either at the temple or at the burial site, the priest would cut the baby's throat, killing it. The procession would enter the burial site, what the Bible refers to as a tophet, and on an altar the body would be burned, a pleasing aroma to their god. The blackened remains would be placed in small terracotta jars and carefully laid to rest. Sometimes they would erect a stele over the grave, a standing stone to help channel divinity and mark important locations. In addition to the formulaic text discussing vows to the gods and whether a human or animal was sacrificed, the stele marking the graves would sometimes contain portrayals of a hand, palm facing out, faces with tongue sticking out, and sometimes typical Semitic iconography, including crescent moons and triangles. Palms, tongue sticking out, crescent moons, and triangles. There's an oracle in Isaiah 57 that is primarily concerned with what a lot of the Bible is concerned with. I'm Yahweh, you've really let me down, but I'm going to restore you to Israel. It's an exilic poem, written in the hopes of a return from Babylon. But it starts out, as these often do, by calling Yahweh's people bastard children, the offspring of whores and adulterers and criminals. Then it moves into more specifics, quote from Stavrakopoulou's translation. But you, come here, sons of a sorceress, seed of an adulterer and a whore. At whom do you jeer? At whom do you widen the mouth, lengthen the tongue? Is it not you, offspring of transgression, seed of deceit, you who warm yourselves among the great trees, under every green tree, slaughtering children in the wadis, under the clefts of the rocks? And there we have our first Moloch parallel in Isaiah 57. Did you hear it? Yahweh, speaking through the author of this passage, demands to know why the Judeans are, like the Moloch sacrifice art, sticking their tongues out in what he perceives to be a mocking fashion. And then he accuses them of specifically sacrificing their children in wadis, seasonally dry riverbeds that flow through valleys. So far, we don't have a lot to go on in connecting this to the Moloch rites besides that iconography parallel, so let's continue. With the dead of the wadi is your portion. They are your lot. Even to them you have poured out a drink offering. You have offered up a grain offering. Should I be comforted by these things? Upon a high and lofty mountain you have made your grave. There you have gone up to offer sacrifice. Behind the door and doorpost you have set your memorial monument. For 100 times you went up to, and enlarged your grave. You cut a pact for yourself with them. You loved their grave. The hand you gazed upon. So it's saying these offerings are being repeatedly associated with vows or pacts or contracts, and it mentions a hand at the grave, like our outfaced palm. So we've got our vow, we've got the hand, and we've got the tongue sticking out motif. We're just missing the word Moloch. So let's bring it home. You lavished the Moloch victim with oil. You multiplied your perfumes. You sent your envoys to a remote place. You made them go down even to Sheol. On your many paths you grew weary, but you did not say it is hopeless. You secured the life of your hand, so therefore you did not grow weak. Whom did you dread and fear that you lied to me? And there it is. Most translations render the term Moloch victim here as Moloch, as in the alleged god, or as king, as there's, once again, a word that's spelled the same with different vowels that can sometimes get confused for Moloch. Yes, these passages are even more confusing because a king, a sacrificial rite, and an alleged all share very similar spellings. Before the Punic child burial discoveries were made, this created a sort of odd puzzle for translators, but with the jars and bones in the dirt, Isaiah 57 makes a hell of a lot more sense. You can see here exactly how easy it is to either misunderstand or intentionally reinterpret the word. It starts out as a description of a victim of child sacrifice or the Moloch rite itself and gets transformed into a word for a god or a king. And in this case, the word king would certainly be an odd fit in a passage with so many links, not just to child sacrifice, but to the Punic Moloch rite specifically. I mean, the imagery is striking. And this further bolsters the case that what's being referred to here is not a god and not a king, but a form of sacrifice that could be provided to any number of gods, Kronos, or Tanit, or Baal, or, well, Yahweh. Within the Leviticus 20 passage I quoted at the beginning, the one talking about how much Yahweh hates the practice, there is exactly one phrase that is often thought to prevent the idea of Moloch as a god from being completely abandoned. Quote, I myself shall turn my face against that man and his clan, and I shall cut him off, and all who go whoring after him to whore after Molech. And the idea goes that you don't whore after a practice, but you whore after gods and foreign governments and things like that. It's part of a fairly consistent misogyny present within the Bible from start to finish, where sex workers and women as cheaters are condemned, but in line with the sexual mores of the time, men fucking around is considered fairly normal. Israel, referring to Yahwists and ethnic Judahites and Samaritans here, is portrayed constantly as a woman who whores after all of the foreign husbands. When we get deeper into Ezekiel and Jeremiah and their relationship with women in a future episode, we will deal with this kind of misogynistic rhetoric in far more depth and cranked up to an insane level. Anyway, this passage about whoring after Moloch is the closest we get to problematizing the idea that Moloch was never a god. Stavrakopoulou points out, however, that objects can be whored after in the Bible, such as in Judges 8, quote, "And Gideon made them into an ephod and set it out in his town in Ophrah, and all Israel went whoring after it there." And she goes on to note that something in this rite could be what's whored after in the Leviticus passage. So, at the very least, this is not exactly a slam dunk case, and with the thousands of infant bodies buried for the Mulkadam ritual throughout the Mediterranean, I think the idea of Moloch as never being a god is much stronger. But now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Were the authors who blamed Manasseh sort of right then? If it came from the Lebanese coast, was this really a foreign Phoenician practice that was imported? Manasseh in Kings is primarily modeled on Ahab, but there's actually one more king who serves as a model for him, and that's Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, Manasseh's own grandfather, who ruled Judah in the mid to late 700s BCE, just before the fall of Samaria. Here's the summary of his reign found in 2 Kings 16, quote, "Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the sight of Yahweh his God, as his ancestor David had done, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made his son pass through the fire, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom Yahweh had driven out before the people of Israel. He sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree." And here we see connections to two things. One is to specifically Manasseh making his son, quote, "pass through the fire," showing how they seem to be connected by the author. And the second is a close connection to Isaiah 57's child sacrifice rite, using the exact phrasing that the author did there, "under every green tree." The real Ahaz reigned in the time of Assyria's big come-up under Tiglath-Pileser III, just before Samaria was destroyed. Ahaz is the first king that's said by the author of Kings to pass his son through the fire, and he's also king during a time when the Molech sacrifices seem to be spreading from Phoenicia around the Mediterranean. These are the early days of the ritual being popular. Whenever it was written, the early part of Isaiah contains a curious passage where the prophet delivers an oracle against Assyria and presumably the brutal centralizing campaigns of Tiglath-Pileser specifically. In chapter 30, it gets properly nasty. Quote, "Truly, Assyria, who beats with the rod, shall be cowed by the voice of Yahweh, and each time the appointed staff passes by, Yahweh will bring down his arm upon it, and will do battle with him as he waves it. The Tophet has long been ready for him. He too is destined for Molech. His fire pit has been made both wide and deep, with plenty of fire and firewood, and with the breath of Yahweh burning in it like a stream of sulfur." Yes, you heard that right. The prophet of Isaiah is hoping that Assyria is slaughtered like an infant offered up as a Molech sacrifice. And that is fascinating as what seems to be an endorsement of the Molech sacrifice, but when it's applied to a people. But there's even more to this passage. Dewrell argues that the bit translated as "has long been ready" by the NJPS here is better rendered as something like "was recently constructed." So the author is either saying, we've had this fire going for a long time, and it's nice and hot and ready for you, just like all the infants from before, or we just built this yesterday, and you, Tiglath-Pileser, are a great test subject. And yet that leaves us with two tantalizing and polarized plausibilities. Either the practice of Molech child sacrifice was thought to be an ancient rite, one so old that Isaiah considers its ritual site to be a long-standing premonition of his hoped-for fall of Assyria, or perhaps even more alarming, It was a relatively new establishment, either under Ahaz or his son Hezekiah, and it's a practice that Isaiah, at least in the early portions, has nothing bad to say about. Indeed, he hopes and predicts Yahweh will use it to consume his imperial enemy. The paint just dried on our Moloch altar. How would you like to hop on there, Tiglath? Of course, in reality, this was a lot of bark with little bite to back it up. Tiglath-Pileser died peacefully at a ripe old age of natural causes. But with Dewrell's argument indicating this passage shows a recency of the Moloch sacrifice rite especially, it's possible that this particular version of child sacrifice was a relatively new phenomenon. Or maybe it developed over time, starting as an idealized practice of sacrificing one's firstborn and then adapting to Phoenician practices and becoming more generalized. Past guest Susan Ackerman has argued this. It's really hard because we don't know when the firstborn sacrifice came from, so we're mostly dating this based on dating of the Bible, how long back we think some of these rites stretch, things like that, but also the Moloch Tophets, as they call them, the burial sites for all of these jars. I don't know that Dewrell's hard and fast delineation between the firstborn child sacrifice rite and the Moloch practices holds a ton of water. He notes the close similarity between the Isaiah 57 passage and the Moloch rite, but the terminology used for the firstborn sacrifice Ahaz is said to make also aligns closely with the Moloch rite. Quote, under every green tree is used in both passages. I think it's important to recognize how unique each of the practices are in the literature, but official or documented cult and the reality on the ground are often quite different. While we have documentation of these practices in idealized or argumentative and polemical form, we don't have archaeological evidence of any of these specifically in Palestine, and little in the way of evidence for the practice in the region in general. This means that Ackerman could be partially right and Dewrell could be partially right. If the firstborn child sacrifice practice existed in some capacity before the popularity of the Moloch rite, it could have been for the Yahweh seen as an evolution of an existing child sacrifice cult, one that started specifically with the firstborn sacrifices and then moving on to vow-based sacrifices. And we can see examples of this throughout history we're exploring. For one, when it comes to the idea of dualism, of a divine battle between good and evil, this idea is extremely critical to apocalypticism, the idea that God's going to come back and defeat the forces of evil in one big final battle. But Mark S. Smith argues that there may have been a form of apocalypticism during the exile, the idea that Yahweh would show up and make everything right again, and yet the ultimate good and evil battle is clearly influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism, bolstered all the more by the fact that it would be the Persians who ended the exile. The point is that both Judean and Jewish ideas of good and evil developed on their own after the influence of Zoroastrianism faded, and these sort of ideas get kind of blended together. So all this to say that I think we could probably speculate about child sacrifice in a similar way. It was in some way native to Palestine, but the popularity of the specific Phoenician Moloch rites found a lot of purchase among Yahwists because they already had a child sacrifice rite in some circles with the firstborn son offering. Again, it's speculative, but until we have better evidence, that is to me as good of a theory as any, one that doesn't require us to imagine a hardline orthodox boundary between firstborn sacrifice and the Moloch vow sacrifices. But I'd like to say that this is, for once, a rather specific argument of my own, not one I'm reconstructing based on modern scholarship in specifics. I'm not arguing this in print, but if you think I'm making a good point and want to write your dissertation on it, you have my blessing. Regardless of where anyone comes down on this, it does seem that the specific Moloch sacrifice, vowing to offer up a child in return for or hope for a divine blessing, gained popularity around the time of Ahaz and Hezekiah. Even if firstborn sacrifice and other types of child sacrifice plausibly could have been older, the Moloch stuff likely had a later start. So let's bring this all back to where we began earlier, with the Jeremiah 32 passage that mentions the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Let's start with the verse in question. Quote, "They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and daughters to Moloch." If we take seriously the idea that Moloch was not a god but a type of sacrifice, the insertion of Baal makes far more sense. The high places mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible as illicit cult sites would typically not have been sites for foreign gods, they would have been sites for Yahweh himself. In this case, the verse becomes clearer and makes complete sense if we simply remove Baal from the equation and read it instead like this. They built the high places in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and daughters as Moloch victims. So either Yahweh was originally named as the recipient of the sacrifice, or like in my reconstruction above, nobody was, which could easily lead the reader to assume that it was Yahweh. Instead of excising the passage, Baal would have been inserted by a redactor, which is why this has become confusing, because at a later point, Moloch was also reinterpreted to be a god rather than a sacrificial rite. In most other cases, though, Moloch as a god fit reasonably well, and so a new deity was born. But the bones buried in jars in the ground are a lot harder to reinterpret. They tell a different story, one of the Moloch sacrifice, a rite in which a vow was made to a god, and a child or a lamb was sacrificed on an altar to fulfill it. It seems to have become rather popular in the 7th century, though the exact date and location of its origins are unknown. It would continue to have some popularity in Carthage and other Punic communities around the Mediterranean until the destruction of Carthage by Rome in the 2nd century BCE, at which point it faded and became fodder for later writers to polemicize against the Carthaginians. For the biblical authors, the rejection of this practice meant a rewrite of law codes and fierce denials that Yahweh would ever command such a thing. But a few traces have survived. Ezekiel's curious claim that Yahweh himself gave a bad law commanding firstborn child sacrifice, the Exodus 22 law that might actually preserve that very law, and one passage I didn't cover last time, from Micah 6, quote, "With what shall I approach Yahweh? Do homage to God on high. Shall I approach him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Would Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins? He has told you, O man, what is good and what Yahweh requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God. Then will your name achieve wisdom." Now, that last part is the famous bit of this oracle, and it's a nice message. Yahweh needs your sacrifices, of course, but what he really wants is for you to be a good and caring and justice-minded person. And yet there's something odd in the middle of it. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? As with the other sacrifices listed, the author, writing around the time of Samaria's destruction, might be using hyperbole. But the fact that it's mentioned in such specific terms, so close to our other early attestations of firstborn child sacrifice, should make us consider that perhaps the author lists the practice precisely because it is not considered an aberration. It's normal cult. Just like it would be ideal, if not practical, to give thousands of rams and streams of oil and all manner of great offerings, so too would it be ideal to offer one's firstborn child. Now, what's more, Micah was a southern prophet, and so much of the accusations around child sacrifice are centered around the south. Northern kings are not associated with child sacrifice, and this creates a problem, one that would be solved through the substitution of a perfect scapegoat, Manasseh. Manasseh's tale, like our circumcision origin stories, is an etiology, a story that seeks to explain a present condition by retrojecting a fiction into the past, this time based around a real guy. And in this case, Manasseh has been co-opted to be part of our story explaining why the people of Judah were exiled. This is done by giving our target king the flavor of a foreigner. Quote from 2 Kings 21, "He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, following the abominable practices of the nations that Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel." So we start by tying him to the people who occupied Palestine before the Israelites did, the impure foreigners who supposedly had nothing to do with Israel or Judah or Yahweh. The author goes on, quote, "For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal. He made a sacred pole, as King Ahab of Israel had done, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them." In this verse, we see the author get a bit more specific, tying Manasseh to the arch-villain, northern king of Israel, Ahab. Manasseh is therefore said to be in all ways foreign and in all ways northern. He is the perfect scapegoat. Even his name is the name of the most prominent northern tribe, Manasseh. There is no better candidate to blame for Judah's destruction than him. In one fell swoop, the author ties him both to the north and to the foreign. But the writer isn't done with his exculpatory masterstroke, so he says that Manasseh, quote, made his son pass through the fire. And this aside, listed among a litany of sins supposedly performed by Manasseh, is probably his most lasting legacy. He's the king who sacrificed his own son. And so he was, all at once, a foreigner, an Israelite, and a child killer. And on top of that, the author has now successfully tied child sacrifice to the north as well, obscuring the fact that it seems to have been primarily associated with Judah in the south. And in the author's argument, because of all of this, Jerusalem had to be destroyed. But did he do it? Did Manasseh kill his kid? Maybe. If he did, it seems to have been a normal part of cult, and Stavrakopoulou argues that the firstborn sacrifice rite would have been part of the royal cult. So if Manasseh killed his son, in other words, there's probably a good chance that many other kings did so. It was a popular practice, it was considered standard and ideal cult, and it cannot be ruled out that Hezekiah, Josiah, Ammon, and a few kings before and after each of these did the same thing. We just don't have enough data to say for sure. And as masterful as the scapegoating of Manasseh as some uniquely evil king was, it did create another problem, because Judah didn't fall for a half century after Manasseh's death. And this delay creates a theological implication that present-day suffering can be caused by some crime in the distant past. If Jerusalem fell because of Manasseh's crime 60 or more years earlier, then maybe Yahweh's punishment has nothing to do with one's own individual choices, but might instead be caused by your ancestors' sins. That idea did not sit well with later writers. The author of Ezekiel, for example, has a different take on who's responsible for Jerusalem's destruction and the end of the Judahite monarchy, and he was incensed by the idea that the figures from the fading past could be blamed. It was you, it was your parents, it was the people who were there. Apparently there was a popular saying at his time, though, a proverb that went something like this: "The fathers have eaten unripe fruit, and the sons' teeth were blunted." The analogy being that the children are suffering because of the mistakes of their parents and grandparents, something that the author of Kings seems to agree with wholeheartedly. But Ezekiel is disturbed by this proverb, saying in chapter 18, quote, "As I live, says Yahweh God, this proverb shall no more be used by you in Israel. Know that all lives are mine. The life of the parent as well as the life of the child is mine. It is only the person who sins who shall die." Jeremiah also addresses this proverb in chapter 31, saying, quote, "I will watch over them to build and to plant, says Yahweh. In those days they shall no longer say, the parents have eaten unripe fruit, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But all shall die for their own sins. The teeth of the one who eats unripe fruit shall be set on edge." Now, intriguingly, the prophet here says that yes, Yahweh might have operated like that in the past, but in the future, everything will be better and more fair. Of course, all of this conflicts with some of the most prominent laws of the Torah. In Deuteronomy 5, which contains a version of the Ten Commandments, it's made explicit that Yahweh does in fact punish children for their parents' crimes, saying, quote, "You shall not bow down to idols or serve them. For I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love and keep my commandments." One time when I was a missionary, one of the seasoned leaders who was uncomfortable with the contradiction between Ezekiel and Jeremiah and this law argued that in the Deuteronomy verse, Yahweh was visiting the sons and grandsons of those who wronged him just to check in on them and give them special attention, because some of the translations use visited rather than punish. Just visiting them to take extra care. Sure, your grandpa was a fuck up, but that means Yahweh is going to take extra special care of you. That's a nice thought. It is definitely not what the author intended. The point is very clearly that Yahweh punishes the descendants of those who wrong him. Like that leader, though, Ezekiel and Jeremiah were uncomfortable with this idea of a God whose justice did not extend to each individual, but could result in prejudicial treatment just because your dad or your granddad or some king like Manasseh was a shithead decades ago, which is a fair concern, but it's not how most people understood divine justice at the time. If you lived long, it's because the gods thought you did well. If not, you must have messed up somewhere, and the gods could continue cursing your family for generations afterward if you didn't rectify the situation. Again, recall Sargon II disappearing and Sennacherib spending his life distancing himself from his father, fearing that he would come into contact with whatever cultic nastiness that caused his father to be cursed by the gods. But Manasseh wasn't cursed by Yahweh. No. He lived a long, long life and died peacefully in his sleep. His reign was longer than any other Judahite king, a staggering 55 years, give or take. If accurate, this would put him among the top 50 longest reigning monarchs of the modern era. The guy lasted a long time. So when the Book of Chronicles was written hundreds of years later and smoothed over a lot of the issues in the Book of Kings, the author added in a little tale to explain why Manasseh got to live so long. After Manasseh's litany of evil deeds, cribbed pretty directly from 2 Kings 21, we get a tale of the king being brought low and repenting. Quote from 2 Chronicles 33. Therefore Yahweh brought against them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh captive in manacles, bound him with fetters, and brought him to Babylon. While he was in distress, he entreated the favor of Yahweh his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. He prayed to him, and God received his entreaty, heard his plea, and restored him again to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that Yahweh indeed was God. And from there it goes on to say that Manasseh did the same thing as Hezekiah, tearing down the high places and reforming Judah. See, he may have killed his kid, but he couldn't have been the cause of Jerusalem's downfall because he was sorry for it after being brutalized by Assyria and imprisoned. Problem solved. So that's the Manasseh of the Hebrew Bible. Let's talk about the real guy. The temptation must have been there, at least to some degree, to try, as many of his predecessors had done, to throw off the Assyrian imperial yoke. Sure, Esarhaddon had written his long-ass oath treaty and made everyone pinky swear to not rebel against his weird setup of having his younger son Ashurbanipal rule as emperor, while his elder son, Shamash-shum-ukin, ruled over Babylon to the south. But still, the pressure from the population to rebel against the imperial hegemon was seriously felt by so many of these kings because at the end of the day, it was peasants and artisans' surplus production that was going to be carried off to feed and clothe and enrich Nineveh. The kings and the elites almost certainly did their best to protect their own wealth and interests from being transported to Assyria, which meant offloading the tax burden of being a vassal state onto the average worker. And those workers could certainly get annoyed when the burden became too great, and in turn they struggled to feed their families. That's why you see so much hate toward the elites in these early prophetic writings. The tax burden for the empire increased, and the wealthy, curiously, didn't seem to take much of a hit. But Manasseh was at least a stable hand at the wheel. He didn't rebel. He apparently didn't feel that pressure, and it's even possible that with Palestine as the new buffer zone for the Egyptian expanses of the empire, Assyria gave them better conditions and lowered vassalage payments and taxation to keep Judah happy. They needed that road. That's where Manasseh shows up in the record, in Assyrian annals, noting that he supplied the campaigns into Egypt that we'll talk about next time in our Ashurbanipal episode. The stream of troops from Assyria stopped by Judah on the road to resupply and pick up some auxiliary troops on the long trek down south to Egypt. Archaeology in Judah shows an increase in domestic production and a significant recovery from the destruction of Hezekiah's reign, the return of wine and olive oil exports, as well as luxury goods for the elites of the Jerusalem kingdom. This is not a kingdom with the pressure to revolt. It's a decently well-off subject on a critical artery between Assyria and its grand prize of Egypt. As a good and loyal vassal with decent economic conditions, Manasseh doesn't seem to have put up much of a stink and instead charted a course that one could call cooperation or, uncharitably, appeasement. Stavrakopoulou goes pretty hard in the assumptions of some historians and some scholars who claim that the unique closeness to Assyria was a defining feature of Manasseh's reign in real, actual history. She makes a solid case discussing the issues of how polemical and theologically targeted the Manasseh passages are. But to add to this a bit, we also know that Manasseh was at least not uniquely bent to Assyria's hegemony through choice or by force. Because if Manasseh was, then so was his father Hezekiah. To reiterate what we talked about a couple episodes back, that's why the king's author had to invent the story of Yahweh's angel killing nearly 200,000 Assyrian troops, to hide the fact that old Hezekiah cut a deal, accepting the emptying of his royal and cultic coffers and the reduction of his land and the deportation of some of his royal court in return for Assyria backing off from Jerusalem. He was cowed by Assyria, and for the remaining years of his reign, possibly for over a decade, he just paid the tax bill and stopped rebelling as the kingdom slowly rebuilt from the humiliating defeat. If you'll recall, the same problem in reverse also plagues Jehu's account, where his Assyrian vassalage, depicted in toe-sucking glory on some Assyrian art, goes unmentioned by the author of Kings, who considers him the best guy of all time, nearly as good as someone like Josiah or Hezekiah. The writer is clearly not a reliable narrator, especially when it comes to accurately portraying the relationship between various kings in Assyria. He either didn't have the full story and filled the gaps, or he did have decent information and decided to overwrite it in service of the story he wanted to tell, maybe a mix of the two. And in this case, the argument that Manasseh was a unique Assyria-phile continues to fall apart when we recognize why the author needs such a strong villain for his story. It's all there in the opening salvo. Manasseh was basically a northerner. He wasn't a real Judahite anyway, and so he brought in all of these foreign practices. It was Manasseh's fault that Jerusalem fell. As we'll see over the next few episodes, though, Manasseh is most certainly not the reason Jerusalem will eventually be ground into dust. There are some kings we can blame. He's not one of them. The reality then is that Manasseh was a pretty regular king who followed in his father's footsteps after the routing of the majority of Judah outside of Jerusalem. He ruled for around half a century, and seems to have been as good of a king as one could hope for, considering the difficult decades before his reign began. Maybe he sacrificed his son, maybe he didn't. I doubt the author of Kings knew with much certainty either. He reigned for a staggering 55 years, from the mid to late 690s to around 642 BCE, probably dying of old age in his late 60s or early 70s, passing the throne to his son Amon, a name that will not be on the test, because he only sticks around for a couple years before getting himself killed. So R.I.P. to Manasseh, a king who was probably libeled and who, if circumstances had been different, might have been known as one of the great kings of Judah. And yet the theme of child sacrifice that plagues Manasseh's account would have a significant afterlife. The stories of Abraham and Isaac, of Jephthah's daughter, the mentions of Moloch, it's a pretty big part of the biblical story. And even if prohibited, it would continue to have a lot of literary and spiritual significance as an idea. In sermons from a variety of pastors and leaders over the year, I've heard repeatedly the insistence that Jesus was himself represented in the ram that replaced Isaac on the altar, at least in spirit. Now, the question of how Jesus' death actually functions in its spiritual and theological mechanics is an entire field of study called soteriology, which we'll get into in a million episodes. But for now, it's enough to note that this concept of a divine sacrifice of God's only human son does seem to have a sort of spiritual connection back to the Hebrew Bible. It seems to be something that the writers of some New Testament texts are alluding to, and it also became an important part of Christian culture and history. It's a theme that Sufjan Stevens picks up on in his haunting song, Abraham.
Abraham, put off on your son, take instead the ram until Jesus comes.
But he's not the only one. This is a fairly common comparison. Of course, this creates a problem for those who want to claim that there is no child sacrifice command in the Bible, and those who are uncomfortable with admitting that Jesus' death is a sort of metaphorical form of child sacrifice. And boy, do these conversations get stupid sometimes. Allow me a tangent. In the past few years, conservative Christians leaving the church have labeled their journey as deconstructing their faith. The implication being that some reconstruct a faith out of the pieces as they figure out what's important to them in life and what they really believe once their dogmatic beliefs and rigid indoctrination they were raised with have been stripped away. Many become more progressive Christians at churches that affirm LGBT people and aren't focused on like a punitive and exclusive version of the faith. It's not really something that I actively participated in, but who cares? Whatever people need to figure their shit out is fine by me. But this idea of deconstructing, in turn, has sparked a backlash from conservatives and fundamentalists who are nothing if not always in the middle of this week's newest moral panic. Deconstruction was the topic of a conversation between Biola University professor of apologetics Sean McDowell and two of his fellow apologists, Elisa Childers and the eminently smarmy Tim Barnett. Barnett, in a tweet from the First Women's March in 2017, says this: "If this was 3000 BC, these same women would be marching for the right to sacrifice their children to Moloch." Now, never mind the fact that abortion is not the same thing as child sacrifice, nor the fact that the Bible commands child sacrifice, nor the fact that there is no evidence for a god named Moloch. 3000 BC? You're off by well over a millennium, for even the gods that some scholars like John Day have proposed might be tied to Moloch, like Milkard or Milcom. That's the level of rigor you get with these kinds of assholes. Anyway, together, Barnett and Childers shit out what is undoubtedly the world's most tedious and whiny book about how deconstruction is some great evil, and in this interview about their book with McDowell, the trio went on the attack against people who are part of the whole deconstruction movement. Let's let them blather for a few moments.
Do you think most people who deconstruct, if you can say most, if not many, were ever in the faith? And before you answer, because I realize this is a dangerous question going on the record, I will tell you what I think from my experience. I don't think most were. Now, I'm going to get some hate mail for this. Some people are going to really critique me, and there's two reasons why. I'm not saying all. That's not my point. I can't judge anybody's heart. But one question I've asked on air and over again in person is not the story of somebody leaving the faith, but tell me when you got in. Tell me that moment when you realized you were a sinner in need of God's grace and you cried out for forgiveness. It's incredible how many times, the vast majority of times, I get a blank stare, which tells me you are part of the club sociologically, but maybe not fully in the faith. The second thing is, when I look at a lot of people who are deconstructing in the way you describe it and do TikTok videos, the theological critiques are so often so shallow and indicate they're attacking a straw man. Either they're intentionally twisting Christianity because they're angry about it, or they never understood it in the first place. So I can't say all. I would never say that. But in my experience and my research, I think most people who have deconstructed, again, in the way of just leaving the Christian faith, were not in the Christian faith in the first place. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think, Tim?
I totally agree. And you took the words out of my mouth. I mean, again, I don't know the heart of the individual. But what I can do is, I go on, Deconstructing Girls Instagram account, and I see what this
I knew you followed that one, Tim. I knew it. Sorry, keep going.
I mean, they all go by these names, right? And that's a real account.
Now, this is some classic conservative Christian doublespeak in here. They're not saying that everyone who left Christianity was a fake Christian to begin with, but you have to prove to them otherwise, and they'd certainly like to plant the idea in their viewers' heads. I'm not judging. They're not judging your heart at all. No, that would be a sin. Except that is obviously exactly what they're doing, and they're happy to lie to your face about what they're doing because they are the used car salesmen of the tackiest and shittiest version of Christianity. Don't get me wrong, I don't think accounts like Deconstruction Girl or any of the other counter-apologetics channels are particularly healthy. People who leave Christianity and get sucked into the atheist and counter-apologist and skeptic spaces, in my experience, they merely replace their faith with a kind of anti-faith that prevents them from moving on and healing. They spend an inordinate amount of time upsetting themselves by looking backward. So let me emphasize, I am not defending this person because I like her content or know her. I don't. I'm sure she's lovely, even if I think what she's doing is misguided at best. But I am someone who gave his life to Christ, who wept tears of joy at discovering what I thought was the truth, who has hundreds of witnesses to the reality of my faith, who was a missionary that hiked deep into the Nepalese wilderness at my own significant expense to share the good news. I emptied my bank account and abandoned a pretty solid income because I had a hunger to follow Jesus. I think I am well equipped to address this sort of thing. So it is the big misunderstanding of Deconstruction Girl that has made Tim and Sean and Alyssa declare her a fake Christian? Let's listen.
She put out, we red penned it. She said the primary belief of Christianity is child sacrifice. That's the central belief. And I just think, and then in like the comment, she wrote, there's no coming back from this one kind of thing. And I'm thinking, first of all, I mean, this is easy to respond to. But second of all, this is someone who says they were a Christian, and yet they think that our central belief is that in child sacrifice. I mean, my 7-year-old can respond to that challenge. My 7-year-old knows that Jesus was a full-grown man when he gave his life on a cross, and he willingly gave that life. And so it was, so when you see that straw man, as you just described, and these straw men are everywhere, you can only come to two kinds of conclusions. One is they are being deliberately misrepresenting Christianity.
Yeah.
Now I don't want to go there. So I'm just going to, what I'm going to assume is you don't get it. And if you don't get that, something as simple as this, as fundamental as this, then maybe you didn't get any of it.
I mean, come the fuck on. There is a strong, obvious thematic connection between child sacrifice and Jesus' death. Go back and watch The Chosen, a show that Sean himself has repeatedly praised. McDowell has had the creator, Dallas Jenkins, on his show. For Christ's sake, The Chosen literally ends its pilot episode by comparing Jesus with a sacrificial lamb. And McDowell and Barnett are not raking Jenkins over the coals for this comparison because it's completely mundane and inoffensive. These folks are happy to leverage these connections in talking about Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament sacrificial cult practice when it suits them, while also distancing themselves from any troubling implications of this rhetoric and the doctrines that come about as a result of comparing a human to a sacrificial animal. It's slanderous to cast folks who notice the darkness of the juxtaposition as being stupid or missing the point. They might not agree with you that having an executed person as the center of your faith is some beautiful or glorious thing, but I don't think that makes them idiots. They learn this stuff from you. You just don't like it. Now, to be clear, I don't agree with Deconstruction Girl here totally. I'm not out to attack Christianity like she is, and I think what she does in her comparison is corny and ineffective. Sorry, it's a gotcha, and it's inherently pretty masturbatory. Nobody's convinced to leave their deeply held faith by appealing to Jesus as a child sacrifice. But Sean and Tim tripping over each other in their rush to say it's not child sacrifice also intentionally obfuscates the point. Jesus' death does not have the literary power it does without this long history of human and animal sacrifice hanging over the biblical text, nor does there develop a long history of Christians noting these parallels approvingly. Comparisons of Jesus with literal sacrifice are done so casually by Christians that they barely notice they're doing it. But all of that, the good and the bad, the ugly and the beautiful, is thrown in the dumpster in a heartbeat by these apologist assholes so that they can delegitimize someone's former faith. They don't care about the Bible and its history in any real sense. It is only ever interesting to them so far as it is useful in these kinds of attacks on others and defenses of themselves and their dogmas, lashing out at any real or perceived threat. And as an aside, it is also wild just how few people are actually quote-unquote real Christians if you take this kind of rhetoric seriously. Realistically, what they're intending to do is to exclude everyone who isn't their specific kind of conservative right-wing evangelical. That's what's most important to them. But if folks like Tim ever pulled their churches, they would find that 95% of their own congregation is made up of fake Christians in one way or another by this kind of standard. Heaven's apparently going to be about 30 of these guys jacking each other off and complimenting each other for getting everything exactly right, I guess. Anyway, I'll take Sufjan's hauntingly gorgeous reflection on human sacrifice with all its dark implications over the whining and inaccurate and self-defeating temper tantrums of conservative Christians any day of the week. Of course, I understand why people like Sean and Tim circle the wagons. Having your sacred book and its real history steeped in child sacrifice is a tough pill to swallow. The biblical authors felt much the same way as our apologist friends, and they used similar tactics to distance themselves from the practice of child sacrifice. It's hard to come to terms with the brutalities of the past, but it's much easier to cast all evils onto foreigners and allegedly foreign-influenced figures like Manasseh. It's a struggle that we've seen throughout this episode. Child sacrifice was so important to the mythology and the history of the Bible that rewriting it and not just starting from scratch left a heap of difficult material to try and rework into some kind of coherent theology, with some pieces that were bound to not quite fit into the picture. These changes would be among several in the biblical authors' attempts to refine what I might call correct cult, what could be deemed orthodox and ideal practice. The specification of correct cult as a form of boundary creation has a few effects. First, it codifies to some degree things that were already commonly practiced, but it also helps to direct and influence common practice. Take the example of circumcision, a practice that existed in real life and that predated probably all of the Bible. It was codified and authorized by the writers and editors of the Torah, who collected folk tales or invented stories that established why circumcision was an important cultural practice, as by that point it was already fairly standard for Judahites and Israelites, for Yahweh worshippers. So that's an example of an existing reality being codified through literature. On the other hand, the writers of these texts are instead sometimes trying to establish or change practices and beliefs that they think should be more widely known or followed. In these cases, they're not codifying existing cultural practices and beliefs, they're attempting to create them, often as a rejection of older practices and beliefs. And sometimes we can see the practices themselves shifting over time. This is what seems to be happening with the prohibition of child sacrifice throughout the Bible. We can see social norms change from the earliest period of the Covenant Code, where child sacrifice is commanded for all firstborns, to its later rejection as being foreign and therefore wicked, the kind of thing the out-group does, not good and pure and part of the in-group. This rhetoric of the good and local versus the wicked and foreign results in two broad sets of ideologies. On the one hand, those that, like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, primarily blame Israelites and Judahites for their own downfall. They're opposed to foreign influence, sometimes violently so, but they contend that it's the Judahites' own fuck-ups that led to Jerusalem's destruction. On the other hand, there's the author of Kings, who blames the foreign and the foreigner, like Manasseh, for all of society's ills. The tension between these views will color the history of Judaism and Christianity, and even Islam indirectly, down to our present day. Nativist and conservative folks can find their own exclusivist and anti-foreigner tendencies in the Bible, and those who are at least a touch more progressive can find inclusivist stories and rhetoric as well. Hell, if you're really inventive, you can synthesize the two perspectives like Christian conquerors did. They portrayed themselves as being inclusivist through removing foreign influence using any means necessary. Now that's some creative biblical interpretation. But the reality on the ground was different. These practices were mostly not foreign. While the Molochites were probably influenced by the Phoenicians, firstborn child sacrifice wasn't. Asher worship and so-called polytheism were not foreign, and worshiping Yahweh and other gods outside of Jerusalem was not foreign. This was homegrown for the most part, the good and the bad. The strategy of casting child sacrifice in general as a foreign practice continued throughout the Bible's history as the various law codes of the Torah were composed. By the time of the author of what scholars call the Holiness Code in Leviticus and Numbers was writing, probably around 2 centuries after Manasseh's time, it had been fully accepted by the authors that this was a foreign practice through and through. The Zipporah circumcision episode from the Moses story presages a connection made between the rite of circumcision and Yahweh's claim on the firstborn. And this would be picked up on and adapted over time to get rid of the pesky Exodus 22 law that required firstborn sacrifice. Here's a bit from Numbers 8, quote, "You will separate the Levites from the midst of the Israelites, and the Levites will be mine. After this, the Levites will enter to serve the tent of meeting. I will cleanse them, and you will elevate them as an elevation offering. Forgiven, indeed given, are they to me from the midst of the Israelites. In place of the breach of every womb, the firstborn of everyone from the Israelites, I have taken them for myself. For mine is every firstborn among the Israelites, both human and animal, as of the day that I struck every firstborn in the land of Egypt. I sanctified them for myself. I accepted the Levites instead of every firstborn among the Israelites, and gave the Levites as gifts to Aaron and to his sons from the midst of the Israelites, to carry out the service of the Israelites in the tent of meeting, and to atone on behalf of the Israelites. There will not be among the Israelites a plague when the Israelites approach the holy place." End quote. And so this is part of a shift in the ideology. It's going from the firstborns are mine to be sacrificed and consumed as a sacrifice by the god, to a different setup involving the firstborns and a priestly class called the Levites. Here's Heath Dewrell's commentary on the passage. Quote, "Here, as in the covenant code, but unlike in Deuteronomy, the law of the firstborn applies to both human and animal firstborn. In the holiest material, they are both called firstborn, as in the earlier codes, as well as the breach of the womb. Further, as in the covenant code, but unlike in Deuteronomy, there is no explicit distinction between the sexes. Additionally, here, rather than you will give, as in the covenant code, Yahweh, speaking in the first person, repeatedly declares that the firstborn are mine. The agency of the claim is thus shifted from the individual Israelite onto Yahweh. This fact is further underlined by the connection of Yahweh's claim to Israelite firstborn with the original Passover event. By killing the Egyptian firstborn and sparing the Israelites, Yahweh has obtained a perpetual claim on Israelite firstborn, both children and cattle. Yahweh has decided, however, to accept the service of the Levites in lieu of Israelite firstborn." End quote. This is a key part of the development that will take place over the centuries following Jerusalem's destruction. Child sacrifice was out of the question, considered an abominable and, more importantly, foreign practice that no longer had a place in proper Yahwism. But the prominence of the firstborn was shifted into some kind of temple service, with the Levite priestly class substituting in, still remaining tied to Yahweh's claim over the firstborn in the literary connection with Yahweh and the slaughter of the firstborn children of Egypt. And so the Levites, one of the most important priestly classes, is directly tied to child sacrifice and to the claim over the firstborn. The firstborn sacrifice rite was that important to the cultic lore of Yahweh. And while the Judahites left it in the past, child sacrifice continued throughout the central and western Mediterranean. As the centuries passed, the exile progressed in Judean history. Even the memory of the real practice, however, had begun to fade among them, and it instead became the stuff of folklore and legend and presumably grim-style fairy tales, a distant horror with faded fingerprints all over Judean culture. It would not be long after this that any memory of Moloch and its victims would be fully obscured from Jewish memory, replaced by a god who was later recognized as a demon, the child-eating Moloch, fodder for creative types from Milton and Paradise Lost to the writers of the TV show Supernatural. It took thousands of years and some chance discoveries throughout the Mediterranean and as far west as Spain to find the jars that told the small part of the real story again, the charred bones which solved a mystery that stretched back thousands of years. And speaking of this disturbing rediscovery, there's one thing sitting in the background of this entire episode that might be bothering you. One question that hasn't been answered. How the hell could people do this? How could they watch as a priest put a knife to their infant's throat and cut him or her open and then burn the tiny corpse? Didn't they love their children and mourn them? And yeah, it's shocking to most modern sensibilities, particularly in the wealthier countries that most of my listeners come from, where infant mortality rates are low, especially compared to places without access to modern medicine. But Dewrell points out that the attachment people feel to their newborns is different in cultures where that hasn't been the case, where sometimes you couldn't count on every third child to make it past a few years of life, or even a few months. It's a tough topic to discuss because it's part of where these ancient cultures can feel a bit foreign to us. There's a persistent myth that people in the ancient world had an average life expectancy of 30 or 40, and that's not really accurate. Certainly in societies experiencing hardship, that might be the case in some circumstances, and definitely among the laboring classes, that could be the case in hard jobs and among slaves. But the low average age actually comes from a high infant mortality rate. If you made it out of the danger zone of the first couple of years, it was pretty common to make it into your 60s and even beyond that. Not quite modern Swiss life expectancy, but a far cry from the picture that can emerge in the popular imagination. Dewrell, citing anthropologists and other social scientists, notes that mortality rates for the first couple months and then to a lesser extent the first couple years were severe in the ancient world, and in these kinds of societies, there's just less room for attachment to newborns. People in these kinds of societies love their children and cherished them and cared for them, but that develops in a different fashion among different cultures, and especially among cultures that are so accustomed to death in these early years. And so infanticide and its ritualized forms like child sacrifice have sometimes been more likely to take root and have taken root. There is some debate on this subject, so the infant mortality rate hypothesis may not have full power to explain why this happened, but whatever the reasoning people have had for these practices, the reality of child sacrifice is one that probably feels pretty out there to many of us. It's a hard thing to connect with. It's like reading the accounts of slavery and recognizing the brutality and hardline patriarchy of the treatment of women in the Bible even. Though in the cases of slavery and patriarchy, we can often connect with them more based on our own recent history. But if we recognize child sacrifice as something born out of social circumstances like slavery and patriarchy, it becomes at least easier to understand how they could engage in or countenance the practice. And while the authors of the Bible didn't question the institutions of slavery and patriarchy, child sacrifice became viewed as a unique horror to them, and they sought, like many today, reacting to slavery and patriarchy in the Bible, to distance themselves from this embarrassment and moral outrage. The authors and editors redacted it, denied it, recontextualized it, and justified it in some cases. Of course, despite droning on for some 2 hours now about the topic, this is not everything that the Bible has to say about child sacrifice. There's a fair bit that I left on the cutting room floor, and since it hangs over the biblical texts, it will never fully leave us. But for Manasseh's time, I've hopefully covered the basics and laid a foundation that will get us through the rest of the Bible and its history. The probable local origin of at least firstborn sacrifice, the Phoenician coast and its haunting tale, and most importantly, how terrifyingly normal all of this was at the time. This was not something unique to Judah and Yahweh. It was done in so many places throughout the centuries, and it seems to have been more popular in places like Carthage and Sardinia and the like, more than it ever was in Judah at least. But while some communities continued the Moloch ritual for centuries beyond our current moment, child sacrifice in general doesn't seem to have survived the Judahite exile for our Yahwists. For the firstborn in Moloch rites, the earliest texts that condemned the practice seem to date between the late 7th or early 6th centuries, the late 600s or the early 500s, around half a century or more from our present time. Most of the anti-child sacrifice texts, as far as we can tell, were written by folks looking back at how everything had gone wrong, looking for an explanation and somebody to blame for Jerusalem's destruction. How did we lose everything? What's the worst shit our people did? They would have asked themselves, and subconsciously some might have seen Manasseh as the perfect candidate. A northerner, a foreigner, and hey, why not a child killer too? Sure, our people shouldn't have gone along with it, and yes, that's true, but this Manasseh guy and his grandfather Ahaz, weren't they the ones who really led us astray? The reality, though, is that Judah probably never could have avoided being drawn into the coming destruction of Assyria and all of the violence and war that accompanies this downfall. While we'll be able to cast some blame at some Judahites, perhaps, Assyria is an empire that doesn't even realize it's on the threshold of non-existence, and one can hardly blame a vassal out in the sticks for struggling to weather the imperial core's rapid disintegration. Few will survive fully unscathed. Next time, I'll take you through the so-called last great king of Assyria, Manasseh's contemporary Ashurbanipal, and we'll see how this singularly unequipped figure emerges as a symbol of a stagnant and comfortable empire. Ashurbanipal, fairly or not, will leave such an impression on history that he will be echoed in literature and art into the 20th century as a symbol of destructive opulence. Like Manasseh, together we'll take a look at this evidence and decide whether that's a fair portrait or not. All this and more on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast. Make sure to sign up at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast and become a supporter today.
I've been thinking lately about the people I meet, The car wash on the corner and the hole in the street. The way my ankles hurt with shoes on my feet. And I'm wondering if I'm gonna see tomorrow. Father, forgive us for what we must do. You forgive us, we'll forgive you. We'll forgive each other till we both turn blue. Then we'll whistle and go fishing in heaven.